Hello, everyone. Hi, this is Gary Sheffer from the Hudson Area Library Board of Trustees and the Hudson Area Library History Room. This is our first sort of sequel that we've had on the History Room on Zoom. Uh, I'm joined today, once again, by David Voorhees, who's the director of the Jacob Leisler Institute here in Hudson. The Jacob Leisler Institute for the study of early history of New York. David, is that right? Did
Oh,
I?
New York history. That's correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Sorry about that. And then Tina Lesem, who works both part-time at the Institute and is a big part of our team at the library as well too. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Gary.
So we're going to talk about senses today. Now, there was a popular song a few years ago by John Denver called "You Fill Up My Senses." But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about human senses. We're talking about the decennial study of American population, I guess is a way to put it. Every 10 years, we take stock of how many of us there are here in the United States. And we're going through that process now. So I want to talk to Tina and David about it. Tina's been involved in the library's efforts to encourage participation in the census, quite important. And David knows a lot about the history of the census and did a presentation. It was this year, earlier this year, David? It's always hard to remember these days.
I believe it was in January.
Was it in January? It's hard to remember pre-COVID stuff, you know, it seems so long ago. So thank you both for doing this. So Tina, why is the census conducted? Why do we count ourselves?
So every 10 years, it's mandated by law. It's part of the Constitution that every 10 years we take account of the citizenry. And it's important because, one, it is what allows us to apportion representatives, our representatives in Congress. So that's based on population and it's evenly distributed. So that's one major reason for it. It's also really important because it's how literally billions of federal dollars are distributed across the country to communities. So, for things like transportation and roads and hospitals and, emergency services, like all of this is funded with some of that federal money that's sent out based on populations and where the need is. So that's why it's really important to participate.
And that's why the government, to a certain degree this year, has put a big effort into getting people to stand up and be counted. I know that's been done locally, but it's more than just how many of there are you in this house or whatever. What other questions are asked on the census?
They want to know how many people are living in each household, and it's set for a specific day because, of course, people move around. Sometimes they make a move at a certain point in the year, so it's based on April 1st. What is the situation?
I didn't know that.
April 1st, and that's when you say how many people were living there, and then you give the information about the people, their names, their sex, their age, date of birth, and then also it looks at the population in terms of kind of racial makeup and national origins, and all of that information is gathered so we can provide the most data as possible to people who use these enumerations to study our population and how it's changing, and then also as we mentioned to distribute those monies and set how many representatives each state gets. So
yeah. So what's now you got a foot in both of the places we're talking about today. What's the library been doing, Tina, and why? Why is the library involved?
Yeah. So the census knew that libraries are great community centers and that they can provide a lot of assistance to their local community. So the census had it in mind to use libraries in order to help get the word out, to help provide assistance if anybody needs it in filling out the census. So things like, the census is being conducted in a number of ways. So you can fill out your form online, but not everybody necessarily has a computer at home. So the library is somewhere where people can come to use the computers to fill them out. You can respond by phone. Most households, I think all households, were mailed a paper copy. But if someone, if they're mailed a copy in English but need help filling it out or having it translated. Our library is helping with that effort. We have staff members and volunteers who speak a number of different languages. I know we have Mandarin,
Right.
we have, Bengali, we have Spanish translators available to help people here at the library if they need those forms translated. So that's some
That's
of the
great.
ways. But we also, as you mentioned, David gave a talk in January, and that was part of the library's programming to highlight the census and try to make it, interesting and exciting and really get people enthusiastic about, participating in it.
And the library, the history room worked with David and with you on putting together an exhibit.
Right.
So what can David, can you tell us about the exhibit, or maybe Tina, either one of you, what was in the exhibit?
Well, I'll start and then Tina can continue because I was involved in the colonial censuses that were taken in this area. So basically we focused on the earliest census and then as they developed over the colonial period. There's something like 10, 11 censuses that were taken between 1698 and 1786. That included what was then Claverick Landing, present-day Hudson. So that was that part that the Leisler Institute focused on, was explaining the background to the census before 1790.
So I'm going to come back to you, David, and I'm going to ask Tina. The census I remember now, going back to January again, it seems so long ago. It was a great exhibit. But we had actual census, copies of actual census that people could take a look at,
Right.
that was available in the exhibit, and some other things. Maybe you have a better memory than me of what was actually in the exhibit.
So, so one of the great things that we had on display were actual handwritten census books.
That's right.
I think they were from the 1850 census. I feel, I'm sorry, I don't remember, but I think they were from the 1850 census, and you could see where, the census takers who went out probably kept their sort of daily notes, but then copied them over into these census books. So every person living in Hudson, is counted in this book. So you can see their age and, their occupation. So those were really interesting. Another thing that we had, now we didn't have the actual painting, but we did have a copy of a painting that was done of the 1850 census. It may be one of the earliest paintings, like of a census taker.
Right.
Family's information down in that painting. And that was by a painter, David, I'm sure will remember the painter's name, who was from Hudson. He was someone who had worked and lived in Hudson at one time, and then I believe moved to New York City. But so that was kind of an interesting thing with a local connection. And then we had an actual painting by the artist Len Tantillo. He's a contemporary artist, and he kindly loaned us this painting, which he had done. He does historical works, and this was of Claverick Landing in the 1750s, I believe. His research that led him to be able to paint what that may have looked like. So, and then we had other, a lot of other information about the census and how researchers have used the census numbers to talk about Hudson's history. So.
Well, that's great. We'll have to get that all back out again when people can come back to the library. Really,
it was cut short.
It was, and it's a really fantastic exhibit. So, David, here you're up now. So tell us about you mentioned it, the earliest census. When were those taken?
The earliest censuses were taken, well, the earliest known census was from 3800 BC, which was done in Babylon. And it was a very interesting census in the fact that they took more than just a census of people, but they counted livestock, quantities of butter, honey, milk, wool, and vegetables. So we have a good idea of the amount of products that also that they were
Wow.
added a certain.
Yeah.
And the most famous early census, of course, is in the Bible, in the Old Testament, when God commanded Moses to count all the Israelites, with
Right.
the name of each man, his family group, who are 20 years old or older. So it's interesting that children are not counted.
Wow. Do we know why, David, they didn't count children? Were they just looking for, um, from a voting, I mean, from a sort of working standpoint, occupational?
Often these were for military purposes.
Interesting. Okay.
So they
That's
were looking to see, the focus was usually on the men.
on the men. I gotcha. I gotcha. That makes sense. Um, so now you direct an institute that studies the history of New York, the history of early New York, and uh, so how many census, is that how you say it? Censuses were conducted in colonial New York?
Well, there are quite a few enumerations that throughout the whole period. The most famous ones were taken in 1698, 1703, 1712, 1723, 1731, 1737, 1746, 1749, 1756, 1771, and 1786. So those are
Wow.
the most complete censuses we have of that period.
So what does it tell us, David? What I remember your talk, and I remember some of the migration patterns that you could determine from those census. What's your observation looking at them uh, and I remember back, there was some movement from the Albany area down toward the lower Hudson Valley.
A lot of it was affected by warfare,
Okay.
also economic conditions. These raid on Schenectady in 1690 had a large impact on this area, and it caused people to move further away from the frontier, which at that point in time was on the Mohawk Valley.
Right.
So they moved back down into Columbia County, into this area, which at that point of time was part of Albany County.
Right. That's
Um,
right.
then you also had a lot of population pressure coming in from Massachusetts. So it was coming from the east and moving in. And also in the early 18th century, then you had the Palatines coming in,
Right.
coming into Livingston Manor. So you see shifts in population and population growth at those points in time.
So it was sort of Columbia County in this area, a bit of a safe haven from people who were on the frontier, if you will, right? And then also the German Palatines coming over for their own reasons to
Well,
this area.
right. They're imported by Livingston. The Livingston
Right.
family. It was a scheme to bring them in to work in the forest. And,
That's right.
Livingston Manor. It didn't work as well as they had thought it would work.
They'd hoped, right? I remember now. Yes, that's right. And one of the things I remember, David, from the exhibit, looking at some of those handwritten census, was the description of slaves in some of the homes. Were slaves counted as part of the census population? I remember a handwritten entry that described a home with a number of people, and it also mentioned 2 to 3 household slaves. And that maybe wasn't the word they used, but were they counted?
Slaves were enumerated separately.
Okay.
So the categories generally were adult men, 16 over and 16 under, women over 16, and then women under 16, and then slaves per household. So that was generally the way the numerations worked.
Okay. Okay. And from a, and maybe you don't know much about this. This was done by people who went door to door. As Tina mentioned, maybe took notes, knocked on a door, asked how many people were in the household, and then it was obviously collated and put together. The notes were put into a ledger. Is that, Tina, maybe the same way we do it today? And the reason I ask this is I was in a business in New York, in Hudson this morning, and someone from the census came in
Oh.
and asked about it. And in fact, so I have a second question. I know you can go online today and enter it, but we still have people going around taking account of who lives where.
Right. So, and you may have experienced this. I know I received a paper copy of the census questions
Right.
in the mail I think in March, in either early March or maybe even February. Those were mailed out to people, to every household, I believe. So you had the option to fill it out on paper, but also it gave instructions if you preferred to fill it out online, which that's, sort of a quick and easy way to do it. And then you also, they have an option for people to fill out by making a phone call and then answering the questions over the phone. And that service also provides the potential for translators, again, if
okay.
language assistance. That's one way to get it. And then, so if you don't do all of those, any of those options, and they see that your household has not responded at a certain point, and, in previous years, I think it maybe was April 1st when the census counters would go out into the communities and knock on doors, as you say. This year, I think because of COVID, that started happening a bit later in the process. But yes, if they see that your response has not come in, they will go out and look for you. It is required by law that you respond.
Interesting.
And we know that there was a lot of contentiousness in the development of the census this year as to whether or not there would be a citizenship question, which there is not. So people don't need to fear that question as part of the census this year. But you are required by law to respond. And
To respond.
well, at the very least, they want a name and how many people are in that household if you won't provide all of the information. So
that makes sense, because the business I was in, Tina, the census person came in and asked. They haven't been able to get a hold of the person in the
right.
building next door.
Yeah.
And, was there an active business in that adjoining, adjacent building? So they were trying to track down whomever was in there, et cetera. David, one last question for you. Or did you want to jump in there, David?
I just want to say in the colonial period, it was the sheriffs who were responsible for gathering the information. So the instructions were sent out by the governor in order to all the sheriffs and to take an enumeration of, mostly for military purposes, to find out how many men were capable of bearing arms.
Interesting. Now, David, when I think of sheriffs, and we all think of sheriffs today, was it the same kind of responsibility they had back then, which was enforcement of the law, or, the will of the property owner, that kind of thing? Is that words have the same meaning?
It's pretty much the same as then as today in
Okay.
responsibility. Of course, they were much more important in the colonial period. In the making sure that the law was followed.
Okay. It's excellent. So Tina, we're recording this, and it's almost October. I had thought the census was done for this year, this decade. What's the schedule? Do you know
the final day to complete the census this year is September 30th. So we are coming right up.
Wow. Okay. And then when do we know? In other words, when will we begin to see data?
That is an excellent question, and I actually am not sure of the answer.
Okay.
It takes for them to start releasing the data once it's tabulated.
You would expect they would be compiling it as we go, right? So
right.
Hopefully it'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah, well, and of course now we have, computers that can help scan the forms and, tabulate the data. I'm sure they had to wait much longer for it in the colonial era to
exactly
wrap it all up. And as we see, handwrite those books.
Yeah.
So
is that what happened, David? Did the sheriff send like a report to, someone who centrally calculated the final numbers?
The reports would then go to the governor, to the governor's office, and then they would be sent to England.
Okay.
So they would be, tabulated.
Was there, was there any gamesmanship related to the census back then? You know, Tina mentioned some of the controversies this year.
But there were a lot of people who felt that they were immoral. There were people who had fear of the census and thought that there was some kind of witchcraft, or so
Is
they
that
weren't
right?
always forthcoming in the information. And of course, a lot of it too pertained to taxation. So people would not, for example, with slaves, they'd not always be forthcoming how many slaves would be in the household.
I see.
But again, you're dealing with a much smaller population, and for like a place like Columbia County, where you only had a few hundred households that you were dealing with, the sheriffs would know pretty much who was in the household.
I was going to ask you if you had a read on um, how many people in some of these census you mentioned in the
Uh,
county.
well, in 1698, for example, there were about 382 persons living in
Wow.
Columbia County. The 1690 census says there were 36 heads of households at Kinderhook and Claverack. And of course, as we go on throughout the century, the population increases greatly. So that by the time of the American Revolution, you had about 800 families in the area.
Wow. And the population today is somewhere around 60,000, I think, in the county, something like that. I could be wrong.
I think that's what it is. It's
Okay.
been declining, actually.
Yes. Yeah. Despite all of the recent interest in the county. So listen, thank you. David and Tina, this has been fantastic. We started with, you know, me mentioning John Denver's Fill Up My Census. I could sing it, but then the history room on Zoom would be over. We would get canceled. But this is a really important exercise for everyone. You may think it's sort of abstract, but to Tina's point, it really matters on from a democratic representation standpoint, and from I guess you would say your fair share, Tina, right,
Exactly.
of monies, et cetera, that are available to help address social challenges and improve well-being for citizens. So it's quite important. It's why the library's been involved. And David, your talk was fantastic. From January, the cobwebs are starting to come off. I'm starting to remember more of it as we talk about it. But I really appreciate you both being on the history.
Thank you for inviting us.
Terrific.
Gary, yes.
Take care. Maybe, who knows, maybe there'll be a chapter 3. We have to do another sequel, right? Tina and David, number 3. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Gary. And I just want to quickly say that people can give us a call here at the library if they need help
Good.
with their census. Definitely give us a call and we can set up appointments to help them out, either by using the computers or if they need a translator. And then if you go to census.gov, you can look for these earlier censuses. Say if you're, want to look, or the New York State censuses, even the state would do censuses on, the 5th year in between the federal censuses. So, if you knew you had a relative here in Hudson and you want to see their name in those early census records, you can find those on the New York State
great.
pages. So.
And I would like to add that at the Leisler Institute, we have the information relating to the colonial censuses of the area.
Excellent. Excellent. And David, are you, I assume you're not seeing people in person now, or can people come in to inspect?
We are following protocol. People can make an appointment and they come in. We have hand sanitizer. We'll open the windows so that there's fresh air circulating. And of course, we request that masks are worn at all times when doing research.
Terrific. Oh, so great ads. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, David, for adding that information. Great. Thanks again from the History Room on Zoom. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gary. Bye.
Bye.